Have you ever wondered what it feels like when your voice unknowingly touches someone's soul? When your simple melody becomes the key that unlocks a heart frozen in time? Melody Jenkins never imagined her soft singing could pierce through walls of wealth and isolation. But as she dusted the crystal chandelier in the grand foyer of the Montgomery Estate, her gentle voice floated upward, reaching ears that hadn't truly listened to anything in years. Alexander Montgomery stood motionless at the top of the spiral staircase, his coffee forgotten in his hand, as her voice wrapped around him like a warm embrace from the past. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Montgomery Estate, casting long rectangles of light across the marble floors. Melody Jenkins adjusted her plain navy uniform and tightened her ponytail before stepping through the service entrance of the mansion. At 25, Melody had spent the last 3 years working for Elite Cleaning Services, a high-end housekeeping company that catered to the wealthiest residents of Westlake Hills. Today marked her first assignment at the notorious Montgomery Estate, a property shrouded in as much mystery as its reclusive owner. Remember, her supervisor had told her that morning, Mr. Montgomery is never home during scheduled cleanings. That's non-negotiable with his staff. You'll be completely alone, so take your time and be thorough. The estate sprawled across 5 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds. The main house, a modern architectural marvel of glass, stone, and steel. Inside, minimalist luxury defined every space, with art pieces worth more than what Melody would earn in 10 lifetimes adorning the walls. She had cleaned wealthy homes before, but nothing on this scale. "Just another day, another dollar," she whispered to herself, the familiar mantra doing little to calm her nerves as she wheeled her cleaning cart into the grand foyer. Melody had always been the quiet one, the girl who blended into backgrounds and spoke only when necessary. Her shyness wasn't something she was trying to overcome. Rather, it had become a comfortable companion over the years. The only time she ever felt truly free was when she sang, and even then, only when she was certain no one could hear her. As she began dusting the entryway console table with its exotic marble top, a habit as old as her memory kicked in. It started as a hum, barely audible even to her own ears. But as she moved deeper into the house and confirmed her solitude, the melody grew stronger. Her voice filled the empty spaces of the mansion, bouncing off high ceilings and wrapping around expensive furniture. She sang a psalm her mother had taught her long ago, about distant shores and returning home. The lyrics spoke of patience and longing, themes that resonated with her own quiet existence. Singing transformed her tedious work into something almost magical, making time flow differently as she moved from room to room, cleaning and polishing surfaces to perfection. Unknown to Melody, Alexander Montgomery had not left the estate that morning as scheduled. At 38, Alexander had amassed the kind of fortune that allowed him to disappear from public life entirely if he chose to. And 5 years ago, that's exactly what he had done. Following the tragic accident that claimed his wife Claire's life, he had retreated into his work and his solitude, emerging only for the most critical business meetings. The pain of losing Claire had calcified into a rigid routine that kept him functioning but never truly living. A migraine had derailed his plans to leave for the office that morning. Instead, he had retreated to his private suite on the upper level, drawing the blackout curtains and swallowing his medication before surrendering to the darkness. Hours later, as the pain finally began to subside, he became aware of something unusual filtering through his hum of voice. His first instinct was irritation. He had explicit instructions about the cleaning service. They were to come only when he was gone, maintaining his sanctuary without ever disrupting his carefully constructed isolation. Yet as he listened, the irritation gave way to something else. The voice was gentle, untrained but pure, carrying a melody he hadn't heard in years. It was the song Claire had often sung while painting in her studio, a folk melody passed down through her family. The same melody now floated through his home for the first time since her death. Alexander moved silently to his bedroom door and opened it a crack. The voice became clearer, definitely female, definitely unfamiliar, yet singing Claire's psalm with the same wistful quality. His heart hammered against his ribs as he followed the sound, moving through his private quarters to the gallery that overlooked the main living area. There, below him, a young woman in a simple uniform moved about his living room. Her back was to him as she carefully dusted the bookshelves that lined one wall, her voice rising and falling with the melody. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved with an efficiency that suggested professionalism. Yet there was something almost dance-like in her movements as she sang. Alexander stood frozen, afraid that any movement might alert her to his presence and silence the first beautiful thing he had allowed into his life in years. As he watched, memories of Claire flooded back, not with the usual stabbing pain, but with a bittersweet warmth he had forgotten was possible. When the woman's song finally ended, he found himself holding his breath, waiting for more. But she had moved on to another task, her humming softer now, as she polished the coffee table with careful strokes. Without conscious decision, Alexander retreated to his study and picked up the phone. "Martin," he said when his household manager answered, "the cleaning service today. Who did they send?" Ms. Jenkins, sir," Martin replied, surprise evident in his voice at hearing from his employer during cleaning. "Hours. Is there a problem with her work?" Alexander stared out the window at the distant hills. No problem. In fact, I want her specifically assigned to the estate from now on. Make whatever arrangements are necessary." "Very well, sir. But may I ask—" "That's all, Martin, thank you." Alexander hung up before any further questions could be asked, questions he wasn't ready to answer even to himself. Back downstairs, Melody finished the living room and moved on to the kitchen, unaware that her simple songs had just altered the course of her life. The kitchen of the Montgomery Estate was a chef's dream, all gleaming stainless steel and pristine white marble, with professional-grade appliances that had likely seen little use. Melody worked methodically, cleaning each surface to a mirror shine while allowing herself to imagine what it would be like to cook in such a space. Her small apartment featured a kitchenette barely large enough to turn around in, with appliances older than she was and countertops stained by previous tenants. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, as they often did when she was alone. 8 years had passed since cancer had taken her, yet sometimes the grief felt as fresh as yesterday. Her mother had been a singer too, not professionally, but with the kind of natural talent that made people stop and listen. She'd clean houses just like Melody did now, singing through the drudgery to make it bearable. "When you sing, Melody," her mother had once told her, "you transform any space into your own. Never forget that power." Melody hadn't forgotten, though her audience these days consisted mainly of empty rooms and occasionally her cat, Oscar. The thought made her smile as she moved through the mansion, her voice gaining confidence in each new space she claimed with her melody. When she finally finished the main floor and descended to leave, she felt an odd reluctance. There was something about this particular house that resonated with her, as if the walls themselves appreciated her songs. Silly fancy, she told herself. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she had left something of herself behind in those immaculate rooms. 2 days later, Melody was surprised when her supervisor called. "The Montgomery Estate has specifically requested you for all future cleanings," the woman said, sounding as puzzled as Melody felt. "Apparently, they were very impressed with your work. They've even increased their service from bi-weekly to weekly, with you as their dedicated housekeeper." Melody blinked in confusion. "But I never even met anyone there. The house was empty." "Well, someone noticed your work. This is quite unusual. Mr. Montgomery is known to be extremely particular. Consider it a compliment to your skills." As Melody hung up the phone, a flutter of nerves mingled with a strange sense of pleasure. Her work had been noticed, appreciated even. The thought warmed her as she prepared for her next day of assignments. When she returned to the Montgomery Estate the following week, she approached her work with renewed vigor, taking extra care with each task. Without consciously planning to, she found herself singing more freely than before, her voice filling the grand spaces with melodies that ranged from folk songs her mother had taught her to contemporary pieces she loved. Above her, unseen, Alexander Montgomery once again stood listening, his meetings mysteriously rescheduled on cleaning days, his presence in the house a carefully guarded secret. Each week, he found himself looking forward to these stolen moments, when the house came alive with her voice, and the heavy silence that had become his constant companion was temporarily banished. He learned her patterns, which rooms she cleaned first, which songs she preferred in different spaces. In his study, she often sang quieter, more thoughtful pieces. In the sunroom, her voice would grow more cheerful, matching the bright space. He began to work his schedule around these patterns, making sure he was positioned to hear her best performances without risking discovery. Alexander knew his behavior bordered on obsession, yet he couldn't bring himself to stop. Her voice had become a lifeline, pulling him back toward emotions he had long suppressed. Through his household staff and the cleaning service, he had learned her full name, Melody Jenkins, and that small detail seemed almost too perfect to be coincidence. 4 weeks into this strange arrangement, Alexander found himself leading a book of poetry on the coffee table in the living room. Claire's favorite collection, dog-eared at the pages they had once read to each other. He wasn't sure why he had done it, what response he expected, if any. Perhaps it was just a small offering to the voice that had begun to heal something within him. When Melody arrived that day and began her usual routine, she noticed the book immediately. The Montgomery Estate was always immaculately maintained, with nothing ever out of place. The presence of this clearly well-loved volume seemed intentional, like a message left for someone. She carefully picked it up, running her fingers over the worn cover before opening to one of the marked pages. The poem there spoke of resilience and finding beauty in broken things. Without thinking, she began to sing the words, setting them to a melody that seemed to form itself in her mind. Hidden in the study adjacent to the living room, Alexander closed his eyes as her improvised song washed over him. Claire had read that exact poem to him after his first major business failure, reminding him that setbacks could become foundations for something stronger. Hearing those words transformed into music by a voice so full of innocent emotion nearly undid him. When Melody finished cleaning that day, she hesitated before replacing the book exactly as she had found it, marking the page with her song with a small, nearly imperceptible fold at the corner. Alexander found this tiny alteration hours after she had gone. The deliberate nature of it suggested she knew the book had been left intentionally, that perhaps she even suspected she wasn't always alone in the vast house. Rather than alarm him, the thought created a strange sense of connection. The following week, he left another book, this one a collection of myths and legends that had been Claire's childhood favorite. And so began a silent communication between them, leaving books, she responding with psalms inspired by their pages, each exchange deepening a relationship neither could define. Spring turned to summer, and Melody found herself increasingly drawn to her days at the Montgomery Estate. She had begun arriving earlier and staying later, lingering over details that didn't strictly require such attention. The mysterious books continued to appear, each seeming to suggest a specific theme or emotion, and she had embraced the strange game with growing enthusiasm. Sometimes she wondered about the estate's owner, the reclusive billionaire whose name regularly appeared in business publications, but whose face was rarely seen in public these days. The staff she occasionally encountered, the groundskeeper, the personal assistant who sometimes let her in, spoke of him with a mixture of respect and concern, painting a picture of a brilliant but deeply wounded man. On a particularly warm July afternoon, Melody arrived to find not a book, but a slender folder on the piano in the music room, a room she always saved for last in her cleaning routine. Allowing herself a few minutes to admire the magnificent grand piano without daring to touch it. Inside the folder was sheet music for a song she recognized immediately, the very first song she had sung in this house, the one about distant shores and coming home. Her hands trembled as she placed the music on the stand. This was different from the books. This was direct acknowledgement, an unmistakable message that she had been heard, that her voice had reached someone. The realization sent a shiver down her spine, not fear, exactly, but a dizzying sense of exposure. For the first time since beginning her work at the estate, Melody remained silent as she cleaned, her mind racing with questions. Who had been listening? Why had they never revealed themselves? What did they want from her? By the time she reached the music room, her nerves had frayed to breaking point. She stared at the sheet music still positioned on the stand, a challenge she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. To sing now would be to acknowledge the unseen presence, to step willingly into whatever strange dynamic had been building all these months. Alexander watched from the hidden doorway that connected his private study to the music room. He had never ventured so close before, had never taken such a risk of discovery. But today felt different, pivotal somehow. The sheet music had been impulsive, perhaps too forward, potentially frightening. Now, seeing her obvious distress, he regretted his boldness. He was about to retreat when Melody straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The melody filled the room, her voice stronger and more confident than he had ever heard it, as if she were deliberately projecting to an audience she couldn't see but knew was there. The song built to its emotional peak, the lyrics speaking of finally finding harbor after a long journey. As the last note faded, Alexander found himself moving before conscious thought could stop him, stepping through the doorway into plain sight. Melody gasped, her hand flying to her throat, as a tall figure emerged from a door she hadn't even known existed. The man before her was instantly recognizable from the occasional news photos she had seen. Alexander Montgomery himself, though considerably less polished than his public image. His dark hair was slightly too long, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and fatigue lined his eyes, yet there was an intensity in his gaze that held her motionless. "Please," he said, his voice rough with disuse, "don't stop." The silence stretched between them, taut with unasked questions. Melody's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it across the room. "How long have you been listening?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since the first day." His honesty was disarming. "I should apologize for the deception, but I'm not sorry I heard you sing." Melody's mind raced, piecing together the strange events of the past, months, the requested scheduling, the books, the growing sense of performing for an unseen audience. "Why didn't you just speak to me?" Alexander moved further into the room, but maintained his distance, as if afraid any sudden movement might cause her to flee. "At first, I didn't want to frighten you. Then, as time passed, I didn't know how to explain." He gestured vaguely around them. "This, what your voices meant. I don't understand. That first song you sang, the one about distant shores, my wife used to sing it." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Melody knew the tragic story. Of course, everyone in town did. The beloved wife, killed in a terrible accident. The grieving husband, who had all but disappeared from public life afterward. "I'm sorry," she said, the inadequacy of the words stinging her tongue. "Your voice," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "It doesn't sound like hers, but something in the way you sing, the feeling behind it, reminded me of her, reminded me of what it was like to feel something." The raw vulnerability in his confession stripped away any fear Melody might have felt, replacing it with a profound compassion. Here was a man who had everything wealth could buy, and nothing that truly mattered. "The books," she said softly. "They were hers?" He nodded, a ghost of the smile touching his lips. Claire loved poetry, myths, stories of all kinds. She said they were maps of the human heart. He moved toward the piano, running his fingers lightly over its gleaming surface. This was hers too. She played beautifully. Melody stepped back, suddenly aware of her presumption in singing in this space that held so much meaning. "I shouldn't have—" "No," he interrupted, his eyes finding hers with surprising urgency. "That's precisely what you should have done. This house has been silent for too long." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I've been silent for too long." The admission seemed to cost him, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if releasing a burden carried too far. Melody felt the strange intimacy of the moment she, a cleaning woman, standing in the private sanctuary of one of the wealthiest men in the state, discussing emotions neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. "What happens next?" she asked, surprising herself with her directness. Alexander looked equally startled by the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't plan beyond this moment." He studied her, really seeing her for the first time, and not just as a voice that had stirred memories, but as a person in her own right. "But I would very much like to hear you sing again, properly, not hiding away and listening like some gothic novel character." Despite everything, Melody found herself smiling at the self-deprecating comparison. "I'm not a performer, Mr. Montgomery. I just sing for myself." "Alexander," he corrected gently. And you've been singing for me too, whether you knew it or not. He gestured toward the sheet music still on the stand. Would you? One more time? Melody hesitated, then nodded. As she sang, she watched Alexander's face transform, the hard lines softening, his eyes closing as he allowed the music to wash over him. She understood then what her voice had become for him, not just a reminder of his past, but a bridge toward a future where feeling might be possible again. When the song ended, Alexander opened his eyes and met her gaze directly. Would you consider a proposition, Ms. Jenkins? Melody, she corrected, mirroring his earlier gesture. Melody, he acknowledged with the barest hint of a smile. Would you consider coming here not as a cleaner but as a singer? This house needs music again. Perhaps I do too. The offer hung between them, unexpected and life-altering. Melody thought of her cramped apartment, her struggle to make ends meet, her dormant dreams of doing something more with her voice than serenading empty rooms. I'd need to think about it, she said finally. Of course. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, handing it to her with a steadiness that belied the significance of the gesture. My private number, when you've decided. As Melody left the estate that day, card clutched tightly in her hand, she felt as though she had stepped into someone else's life, someone braver and more adventurous than she had ever allowed herself to be. 3 days passed before Melody found the courage to call the number Alexander had given her. 3 days of turning the strange encounter over in her mind, of questioning her sanity for even considering his offer. Montgomery, his voice answered on the second ring, crisp and businesslike. It's Melody, Melody Jenkins. She paused, heart racing. About your proposition. You've reached a decision? The formality in his tone had softened, though caution remained. I have questions first. Fair enough. Would you be more comfortable discussing them in person? Which was how Melody found herself seated in the sunroom of the Montgomery Estate the following afternoon, a delicate china teacup in her hands, and the mansion's enigmatic owner regarding her from across a small table. Dressed in dark trousers and a light blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, Alexander looked more approachable than she remembered, though no less intense. So, he said after they had exchanged awkward pleasantries, your questions. Melody gathered her courage. What exactly would this position entail? You said you wanted me to sing, but I don't understand what that means in practical terms. Alexander set down his cup, considering. To be honest, I haven't fully defined it myself. At minimum, I envision regular performances here at the house perhaps 2 or 3 times a week. Beyond that, he hesitated. Claire always wanted to establish a music program for underprivileged children. She believed in the healing power of music. Perhaps you could help develop something along those lines. The mention of children's music education caught Melody by surprise. It aligned so perfectly with dreams she had abandoned long ago that it momentarily robbed her of speech. Before my mother died, she said finally, she taught community music classes. I helped her sometimes. It was the happiest I've ever been. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, recognition perhaps, or confirmation of some private theory. Then perhaps this arrangement would benefit us both. The compensation would be substantially more than you earn now, he finished for her. Martin will handle the details, if you accept. Melody nodded slowly, trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. One more question, and please be honest. Is this offer because I remind you of your wife? Because if so, no, Alexander interrupted firmly. That's not it at all. The initial connection, yes, are a psalm awakened memories I had tried to bury. But this offer is about the future, not the past. He leaned forward slightly. You have a gift, Melody, one that should be nurtured and shared, not hidden away in empty houses. Claire would have recognized that immediately. The simplicity of his answer disarmed her final reservations. Then yes, she said, I accept. The transition from housekeeper to musician in residence at the Montgomery Estate unfolded gradually over the following weeks. Melody gave notice at the cleaning service, explaining that she had accepted a private position, though she kept the details vague. Her supervisor seemed skeptical but wished her well. Alexander had Martin clear out and renovate a small cottage on the estate grounds, offering it to Melody as part of her compensation package. After the years in her tiny apartment, the cottage felt like a palace, with its open floor plan, high ceilings, and windows that looked out over the estate gardens. Their working relationship began cautiously. 3 afternoons a week, Melody would arrive at the main house and sing in the music room for an hour, while Alexander listened from an armchair near the piano. At first, their interactions remained formal, limited to discussions of music selection and schedule coordination. But as summer progressed, something began to shift. Alexander started asking about her life, her background, her dreams beyond singing. In turn, Melody found the courage to draw him out, gently probing the walls he had built around himself since Claire's death. Slowly, a fragile friendship began to form, built on their shared love of music and the unspoken understanding that they were both, in different ways, starting over. By August, Alexander had surprised her with a piano tutor, acknowledging her admission that she had always wanted to learn. To accompany herself, he explained, when she protested the expense. In return, she convinced him to join her occasionally, his rich baritone hesitant at first, but growing more confident with her encouragement. On warm evenings, they sometimes took their sessions to the garden terrace, their voices mingling with the chirping of crickets and the gentle splash of the fountain. Staff members found excuses to linger nearby during these impromptu performances, Martin's weathered face softening as he observed his employer laughing for the first time in years. September brought the launch of the Montgomery Music Foundation, with Melody as its program director. Alexander had purchased and renovated a small community center in one of the city's underserved neighborhoods, transforming it into a state-of-the-art music school that offered free lessons and instruments to children who could not otherwise afford them. Watching Melody work with the children, her natural shyness giving way to passionate instruction, Alexander felt something crack open within him, a capacity for joy he had thought permanently destroyed. The foundation became their shared project, drawing him back into the world as they attended fundraisers and community events together. Gossip inevitably followed. The business press speculated about the reclusive billionaire's mysterious companion, variously described as his assistant, protégé, or secret lover, depending on the publication's standards. Alexander shielded Melody from the worst of it, but she was not naive. "People will talk," she told him one evening, as they reviewed applications for music scholarships in his study. "It doesn't bother me if it doesn't bother you." He had looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her breath catch. "The only opinions that matter to me are those of people I respect. That's a very short list these days." October arrived with a crispness in the air and planning for the foundation's first formal concert. The children had been practicing for weeks, their excitement building as they prepared to perform for parents and community members. Alexander had avoided most public functions since Claire's death, but he had promised to attend this one, understanding what it meant to Melody. The night of the performance, Melody waited nervously backstage at the community center, helping young performers adjust bow ties and secure hairpins. Alexander had texted that he was running late, but would be there before the concert began. As the minutes ticked by with no sign of him, she felt both disappointment and understanding warring within her. Perhaps it had been too much to ask, too soon. She was giving her students a final pep talk when the backstage door opened, and Alexander slipped in, slightly breathless and impeccably dressed in a dark suit. Their eyes met across the room, and he gave her a small nod that conveyed both apology and determination. "You came," she said when she reached his side. "I promised." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "Thank you for giving me a reason to keep that promise." The concert was everything Melody had hoped, for joyful, imperfect, deeply moving. The children played with enthusiasm, if not always precision, their faces shining with pride as they showcased their newfound skills. In the final number, Melody joined them on stage, leading them in a song about finding light in darkness. As she sang, her eyes found Alexander in his front row seat, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen before. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding too profound for words. When the audience rose for a standing ovation, She saw him discreetly wipe his eyes before joining the applause. At the reception afterward, Alexander moved through the crowd with surprising ease, congratulating young musicians and charming parents who had no idea they were speaking to the foundation's benefactor. Melody watched him from across the room, a strange tightness in her chest that she wasn't ready to name. It was nearly midnight when they finally returned to the estate, the triumph of the evening humming between them like electricity. Alexander invited her into the main house for a celebratory drink, leading her not to the formal living room, but to his private study, a space she had never entered before. The room reflected its owner, elegant yet comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive desk positioned to view the gardens. Family photos populated the shelves, most featuring a striking woman with auburn hair and a vivacious smile. Claire, Melody presumed, finally seeing the face that had shaped so much of their strange journey together. Alexander followed her gaze to the photographs. "I couldn't look at these for the longest time," he admitted, handing her a glass of amber liquid. "Martin wanted to put them away, but I wouldn't let him. Punishment, perhaps." "And now?" Melody asked softly. "Now I can see her smile and remember the good without drowning in the loss." He raised his glass slightly. "Progress, of a sort." They settled into leather armchairs near the unlit fireplace, the day's events giving way to comfortable silence. Melody felt the weight of unspoken words between them, questions that had hovered at the edges of their relationship for months. "Why did you really offer me this position?" she asked finally, the lateness of the hour and the warmth of the bourbon lending her courage. "The truth, Alexander." He studied the liquid in his glass for a long moment before answering. "Because your voice made me feel alive again when I had forgotten how." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Because in your singing, I heard someone who understood loneliness but hadn't surrendered to it, and I needed that reminder." The simple honesty of his answer left her momentarily speechless. "And now?" she asked, when she found her voice again. "What am I to you now?" Alexander set his glass down carefully, his movements deliberate. "Now you are Melody," he said, her name sounding like a caress in his deep voice. "Not a replacement, not a reminder, not a project. Just yourself, the woman who brought music back into my life when I thought the silence would last forever." Something shifted between them in that moment, the careful boundaries they had maintained beginning to blur. Melody felt herself standing at a precipice, knowing that whatever happened next would irrevocably change everything. "I should go," she said, rising from her chair. "It's late, and tomorrow, stay." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Alexander stood too, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "No, I don't mean." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly less the composed billionaire and more the vulnerable man she had glimpsed in rare moments. "Just talk with me a while longer." Relief and something like disappointment mingled in her chest as she nodded and settled back into her chair. They talked until dawn painted the sky in watercolor hues, about everything and nothing, childhood memories, favorite books, dreams deferred and found again. It was the kind of conversation that forms a foundation, brick by careful brick. When Melody finally left, walking the path to her cottage as birds began their morning songs, she knew with absolute certainty that she was falling in love with Alexander Montgomery. The realization terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. What she couldn't know was that Alexander stood at his study window, watching her go, fighting the urge to call her back and finding, for the first time since Claire's death, that the thought of loving again felt like possibility rather than then betrayal. As autumn deepened, the Montgomery Estate underwent a subtle transformation. Rooms that had been closed off for years were opened and aired. Fresh flowers appeared in vases throughout the house. Most significantly, music filled the spaces at all hours, not just during Melody's formal sessions, but flowing from the sound system Alexander had installed in every room, as if the house itself were learning to sing again. The foundation flourished under their joint guidance. Alexander's business acumen combined with Melody's passionate advocacy created a program that quickly gained recognition throughout the region. They were invited to speak at arts education conferences, and a feature in a national magazine brought attention to their work with at-risk youth. Through it all, the nature of their relationship remained undefined, hovering in that delicate space between friendship and something more. They worked closely together, shared meals and conversations, occasionally touched hands or shoulders in moments of connection, yet neither seemed willing to risk the fragile balance they had achieved. Until the anniversary of Claire's death in late November, Alexander had been withdrawing for days, his usual warmth giving way to distraction and distance. Melody gave him space, understanding the significance of the approaching date without needing to be told. When the day arrived, she debated staying away entirely, but ultimately decided to offer her presence without demands, leaving a simple note with Martin to be delivered. "I'm here, if you need me." Or, "Not here, if that's better. Your choice." Hours passed with no response. As evening fell, Melody resigned herself to a quiet night in her cottage, trying not to worry about the man whose happiness had somehow become entwined with her own. She was curled on her sofa with a book when a knock at her door startled her. Alexander stood on her porch, snow dusting his dark coat and hair, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes clear. Without a word, Melody stepped aside to let him in. They moved in silence to her small living room, where a fire crackled in the wood stove. Alexander removed his coat, but remained standing, his gaze moving around the space that reflected Melody's growing confidence. Musical instruments in one corner, art on the walls, books everywhere. "I went to her grave today," he said finally, his voice rough. "First time since the funeral." Melody nodded, waiting. "I told her about you." He turned to face her fully. "About the foundation. About how music came back into my life when I least expected it." "Alexander, let me finish, please." He took a deep breath. "For 5 years, I've been living in a mausoleum of my own making, preserving everything exactly as it was when Claire was alive, as if changing anything would be a betrayal." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Today I realized the real betrayal has been refusing to live the life she would have wanted for me." Melody's heart pounded against her ribs as he took another step toward her. "What life is that?" she asked softly. "One with joy in it, with purpose." His hand reached up to touch her cheek, the contact sending warmth cascading through her. "With love, if I'm fortunate enough to find it again." The word hung between them, charged with possibility. Melody leaned into his touch, her own hand coming up to cover his. "Alexander," she whispered, his name a question and answer both. When he kissed her, it felt like the resolution of a melody that had been building between them for months, natural and inevitable. His arms encircled her waist as hers wound around his neck, their bodies finding harmony as easily as their voices had. When they finally broke apart, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, as if memorizing the moment. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he confessed, vulnerability raw in his voice. "I never thought I'd feel this way at all," Melody replied honestly, her natural shyness giving way to the certainty that this connection between them was too precious to deny. They spent the night talking, sharing parts of themselves they had kept hidden, planning futures that now seemed possible instead of merely wishful thinking. When dawn broke, Alexander reluctantly rose to leave, work commitments impossible to ignore, despite his desire to remain in their newly acknowledged reality. "Have dinner with me tonight," he said at her door, unable to resist stealing one more kiss. "A proper date. I think we've earned it, don't you?" Melody laughed, the sound as musical as her singing. "Technically, we've been dating for months. We just didn't call it that." "Then let's make it official." His smile transformed his face, erasing years of grief and isolation. 7 o'clock. I'll pick you up." As Alexander walked back to the main house, through the early morning mist, his step lighter than it had been in years, he found himself humming the song Melody had first sung in his home, the one about distant shores and coming home. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had been adrift far longer than he'd admitted, even to himself. The day passed in a blur for Melody, her thoughts constantly returning to the night before, to the feeling of Alexander's arms around her, to the vulnerability and strength she had seen in equal measure in his eyes. By the time evening approached, She had changed outfits 3 times, nervous in a way she hadn't been since high school. She finally settled on a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, her dark hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual practical ponytail. When Alexander knocked on her door at precisely 7, the appreciation in his gaze told her she had chosen well. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering her a small bouquet of wildflowers rather than the formal roses she might have expected. "You remembered," she said, touched by the gesture that recalled a conversation months ago about her preference for meadow blooms over hothouse perfection. They dined not at some exclusive restaurant as she had half expected, but at a small Italian place in the historic district, where the owner greeted Alexander by name and led them to a quiet corner table. The normalcy of it surprised her, this man who could command the finest dining in the world, choosing instead a neighborhood establishment with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. "Claire and I came here on our first date," he explained, reading her thoughts with the uncanny perception he sometimes displayed. "I wanted to bring you somewhere that matters to me." The simple honesty of the statement moved her more than any grand gesture could have. Throughout dinner, they talked and laughed with the ease of long acquaintance, yet with the heightened awareness of new possibilities between them. Alexander spoke of his companies, his vision for their future, while Melody shared her growing ambitions for the foundation. Her voice stronger and more confident than the shy woman who had first entered his home would have believed possible. As they lingered over dessert, Alexander reached across the table to take her hand. "I need to ask you something," he said, sudden seriousness in his tone making her heart skip. "That sounds ominous," she replied, trying for lightness despite the sudden flutter of nerves. "Not ominous, important." He hesitated, then continued. "The Montgomery charity ball is next month. It's the first one since Claire did I canceled the others. I'd like you to attend with me." Melody understood immediately the significance of the request. The annual gala was a major social event, covered extensively by local and sometimes national media. Alexander's appearance with her would make their relationship undeniably public, subject to scrutiny and speculation. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Once we do this, your privacy has served its purpose," he finished for her. 5 years of hiding was necessary then. It isn't anymore. His fingers tightened around hers. "I'm not asking you to be my shield or my secret. I'm asking you to be my partner, openly." The word partner hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the immediate context. Melody felt the full impact of what he was offering, not just affection or companionship, but a place beside him in all aspects of his life. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll go with you." The weeks leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of preparation. Alexander insisted on having a gown custom-made for Melody, despite her protests that it was unnecessary. The designer who arrived at the estate with sketches and fabric swatches treated her with the deference usually reserved for celebrities and socialites, a treatment that left Melody both amused and slightly uncomfortable. "You'll need to get used to it," Alexander told her with a wry smile when she mentioned it later. "The world I inhabit comes with certain excesses. I'm not sure I want to get used to it," she admitted. "It seems so removed from what matters." He had looked at her then with a mixture of admiration and tenderness. "And that," he said softly, "is precisely why I need you in that world with me." Between fittings and foundation work, their relationship deepened with a naturalness that surprised them both. Alexander began spending more evenings at her cottage than at the main house, preferring its cozy simplicity to his mansion's grandeur. They discovered shared passions beyond music, hiking in the nearby hills, classic films, cooking experiments that sometimes ended in laughter and takeout. They argued, too, about foundation policies, about Alexander's occasional tendency to solve problems with money rather than time, about Melody's reluctance to accept the privilege his wealth afforded her. But these disagreements served to strengthen rather than weaken their bond, each learning the other's boundaries and values in the process. Through it all, music remained their common language. Evenings often ended with them at the piano, her voice in his hands creating something neither could achieve alone. They had begun composing together, Alexander's long-dormant talent for arrangement complementing Melody's instinctive gift for melody. The night of the gala arrived with the first real snow of the season, blanketing the city in pristine white that seemed to mute the world beyond the estate's gates. Melody stood before the mirror in her cottage bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The dress was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk that shimmered with subtle silver threading, suggesting starlight caught in fabric. Cut simply but elegantly, it highlighted her slender frame while maintaining the quiet dignity that was intrinsically her. Her dark hair had been styled in loose waves, and the minimal jewelry Alexander had gifted her sapphires that matched her eyes caught the light with every movement. A knock at her door announced Martin, come to escort her to the main house where Alexander waited. The older man's eyes widened appreciatively as she opened the door. Ms. Jenkins, he said with formal warmth, you look remarkable. Thank you, Martin. She smiled at the butler who had become something of a friend in recent months. Is he nervous? Terrified, Martin confirmed with a small smile of his own, though he'd never admit it. Alexander awaited her in the foyer, magnificent in traditional black tie, his tall figure commanding even in stillness. When he turned and saw her, the naked emotion that flashed across his face made every moment of preparation worthwhile. You're breathtaking, he said simply, crossing to take both her hands in his. So are you, she replied, meaning it. The man before her bore little resemblance to the haunted recluse she had first glimpsed months ago. This Alexander stood straight and confident, his eyes clear and focused, his smile genuine if slightly nervous. Ready to face the wolves? He asked, offering his arm. As long as we're facing them together. The drive to the downtown hotel where the gala was being held passed in comfortable silence, each lost in private thoughts. Melody watched the city lights blur past the window of the limousine, still somewhat disbelieving that this was now her life. She, the shy girl who had once cleaned houses for a living, now heading to one of the most exclusive social events of the year, on the arm of Alexander Montgomery. As they pulled up to the hotel entrance, the flash of cameras and the press of reporters became apparent even through the tinted windows. Alexander reached over to squeeze her hand. Last chance to back out, he said, only half joking. Melody took a deep breath, channeling the confidence she had found with him. Not a chance. The moment they stepped from the car, the world erupted in light and sound. Reporters called Alexander's name, cameras tracked their every move, questions flew from all directions. He handled it with practiced ease, his arms steady around her waist as he guided her through the gauntlet with minimal acknowledgement. Inside, the hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland, crystal decorations catching and multiplying the light from thousands of tiny bulbs strung overhead. The city's elite mingled beneath this artificial starscape, conversations pausing momentarily as heads turned to observe the arrival of the man whose absence had been notable for 5 long years, and the unknown woman at Croft. His side. Alexander? A silver-haired man approached, hand extended. Didn't quite believe it when I saw your RSVP. Welcome back to the land of the living. James. Alexander shook the offered hand with genuine warmth. Allow me to introduce Melody Jenkins, director of the Montgomery Music Foundation. Melody registered the subtle emphasis on her professional title rather than any personal designation, appreciating his effort to establish her legitimacy in this circle where credentials mattered. A pleasure, Mr. James Harrington, city councilman and Alexander's former tennis partner. The man's assessment was swift but not unkind. Music Foundation? That's new, isn't it? Our latest initiative, Alexander confirmed. Melody has built something remarkable in a very short time. Ask her about our youth orchestra they're performing at Carnegie next spring. The pride in his voice as he spoke of her work brought warmth to Melody's cheeks, but she managed to describe the Foundation's programs with growing confidence as more guests joined their circle. Alexander remained at her side, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back, in a gesture that was both supportive and subtly possessive. As the evening progressed, Melody began to relax into her role, surprised to find genuine interest in the Foundation among many of the city's philanthropists. Several offered support beyond financial contributions, rehearsal spaces, mentorship programs, connections to established musicians willing to work with their students. During dinner, seated at the head table with Alexander, she leaned close to whisper, "This isn't as terrifying as I expected." He smiled, the expression private despite their public setting. "You're a natural. These people spend their lives determining who's authentic and who isn't. They recognize the real thing when they see it." When Alexander was called away briefly to speak with the event chairman, a woman in her 60s took the vacant seat beside Melody. Her elegant appearance and the deference shown by those nearby marked her as someone of significance. "So," the woman said without preamble, "you're the one who brought our Alexander back from the shadows?" Melody straightened slightly. "I don't know that I'd put it that way, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. I was Claire's godmother." The older woman's gaze was evaluative, but not hostile. "She would have approved of you, I think." The unexpected comment caught Melody off guard. "You can't possibly know that, can't I?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "I've known Alexander since he was a brash young entrepreneur with more ideas than capital. I watched him fall in love with my goddaughter, saw how she transformed him, and I've observed what her loss did to him." She paused, her gaze softening slightly. "Now I see him tonight, looking at you the way he once looked at her, not with the same love, but with the same life in his eyes. Claire would have wanted that for him." Melody felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "Thank you for saying that. I'm not saying it to be kind, my dear. I'm saying it because it's true." Eleanor patted her hand once, then rose as Alexander returned. "Alexander, darling, you've done well for yourself. Don't mess it up this time by working too much." He laughed, bending to kiss the older woman's cheek. "Noted, Eleanor. How's the foundation treating you?" "Well enough. Your young lady and I were just getting acquainted. I've volunteered my services to your music program, whether you want them or not." After she had moved on, Alexander turned to Melody with a questioning look. "Everything all right?" "Yes." She smiled, feeling a new certainty settle within her. "Better than all right." When the orchestra began playing after dinner, Alexander led her onto the dance floor without hesitation. They moved together with the same natural harmony they found in their music, his hand warm against her back, hers resting lightly on his shoulder. "Everyone's watching us," she murmured, aware of the speculative glances and whispered conversations around the perimeter of the dance floor. "Let them," he replied, his gaze never leaving her face. "I spent too long hiding from life, Melody. I'm done with shadows." As the music swelled around them, he pulled her closer, pressing his cheek against her hair. "I love you," he said quietly, the words meant for her alone despite their public setting. "I should have said it weeks ago. I've known it longer." Melody's heart seemed to stop, then restart with renewed purpose. She drew back slightly to meet his eyes, finding in them a certainty that matched her own. "I love you too," she answered, the words simple but profound in their truth. Around them, the gala continued, camera flashes occasionally capturing moments for society pages and business publications. But in their private bubble of music and newfound declarations, Alexander and Melody moved as if they were the only two people in the room. Later, when they had returned to the estate and stood in the quiet of the music room where their journey had begun, Alexander took both her hands in his. "Stay with me tonight," he said, vulnerability and desire mingling in his voice. "Not in the cottage. Here. With me." The request held meaning beyond the physical, representing as it did his readiness to fully integrate their lives, to claim his home as theirs, rather than a shrine to what had been lost. Melody understood this as clearly as if he had spoken the thoughts aloud. "Yes," she said simply, and followed him up the stairs to the master suite that had been his alone for too long. In the months that followed, life settled into new patterns for them both. The Montgomery Estate became a center of activity again, hosting foundation events, student recitals, and intimate gatherings of friends old and new. Alexander gradually returned to a more public role in his companies, though he delegated enough responsibility to maintain balance between work and his life with Melody. The cottage became Melody's studio, a space where she could compose and teach without distraction. The foundation expanded, adding programs in neighboring communities and establishing scholarships for particularly gifted students. She flourished in her role, her natural shyness giving way to confident leadership when it came to advocating for her students. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, differences in background and circumstance fading in importance compared to the values and passions they shared. They argued sometimes, challenged each other often, and found in their distinct perspectives a strength neither possessed alone. Spring arrived with renewal beyond the natural world. On the first anniversary of the day Alexander had revealed himself to Melody in the music room, he asked her to meet him there after her afternoon classes at the foundation. She arrived to find the room transformed. Candles flickered on every surface, and flowers meadow blooms like those he had given her on their first official date filled the space with subtle fragrance. The piano stood open, sheet music positioned on the stand, a piece she recognized as one they had been composing together. Alexander waited beside it, uncharacteristically nervous, his hands in the pockets of his casual trousers, rather than the formal attire she had half expected given the obvious planning that had gone into the scene. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling as she crossed to him. "A celebration." He took her hands, drawing her close. "1 year ago today, I finally found the courage to step out of shadows and speak to you. You had been singing in my house for months, filling spaces that had been silent for too long." His thumbs traced circles on her palms, a gesture that had become familiar and cherished. "I had no idea then where that first conversation would lead." "Neither did I," she admitted. "I was so shocked to see you standing there. Terrified might be more accurate," he teased gently. "But you stayed. You sang for me when I asked. You saw something in me worth knowing when most of the world had written me off as a lost cause." "I saw someone in pain," she corrected softly. "Someone whose grief had become a prison. I recognized that because I built similar walls around myself, just less visibly. And together, we found our way out." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box that made her breath catch. "Melody Jenkins, you brought music back into my life when I thought the silence would last forever. You helped me honor the past without being trapped by it. You showed me that love isn't a finite resource that can be used up, but an infinite one that grows with sharing." He opened the box to reveal a ring unlike any she had seen before. Not a traditional diamond, but a sapphire, surrounded by tiny musical notes, crafted in platinum, the design both elegant and uniquely personal. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Not because you sang while cleaning my house, or because you helped rebuild my foundation, but because I cannot imagine my future without your voice, in it literally and figuratively." Tears blurred Melody's vision as she looked from the ring to the man holding it, this complex, brilliant, damaged, healing man who had transformed her life as surely as she had transformed his. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with the full voice he had taught her to embrace. "Yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that promised forever, Melody thought of the shy girl who had once sunned to empty rooms. Believing herself unheard and unseen, that girl could never have imagined that her voice would reach across silence and grief to touch a heart as wounded as her own, creating harmony from discord, hope from despair, love from loneliness. Alexander held her close, his heartbeat strong and sure against her cheek. "Sing for me," he murmured into her hair, the request an echo of their beginning but now infused with all they had become to each other. And Melody sang, her voice filling the room where their journey had begun, knowing with absolute certainty that she would never again sing unheard, that her melodies would always find their perfect listener in the man who had loved her enough to step out of shadows into the music of their shared life. As the last notes faded, Alexander's arms tightened around her. Outside, spring sunlight painted the gardens in vibrant color, promising growth and renewal. Inside, in the quiet sanctuary they had created together, two voices that had once been silenced by different forms of fear now joined in harmony, creating a song that would sustain them through whatever verses life might bring. "I love you," Alexander whispered against her lips, before claiming them in a kiss that spoke of passion and tenderness in equal measure. "I love you too," Melody answered when they parted, holding his gaze with the confidence of a woman who knew herself truly seen and valued. Always. And in that promise, in that moment, all the lyrics they had yet to write stretched before them, not a simple melody, but a complex, beautiful composition unique to them alone. A song begun in silence and solitude that had blossomed into a duet neither had believed possible. A love story that, like the best music, would resonate long after the final note. In the mansion where a shy girl had once sung while cleaning, unaware that her voice was healing a broken heart, two people who had found each other against all odds stood embraced in the soft spring light, their future as bright and promising as the music they created together. And somewhere, perhaps, the universe smiled at the perfect harmony of it all. This unexpected love born from a melody sung in an empty room that had never really been empty at all.